Daddy issues, we all got them. But seriously, I had the pleasure of chatting with Kat DeVos, a fellow magical therapist who I've had an Instagram crush on for a long time. This conversation is a beautiful unfolding of father wounds, which can impact our trust within ourselves and with the world. We chat about how to heal these generational wounds and how to create healthier families. If you're new here, you're listening to the How We Get Thru podcast, a place for you to feel connected through deep and meaningful conversations with healers from all over the world. I'm your host, Jen, a licensed therapist and founder and CEO of the How We Get Thru app. And my mission is to bring you affordable and diverse therapy resources to help you get through the hard stuff, all in one place and at your own pace. Welcome to the How We Get Thru community. Welcome back to the How We Get Thru podcast. We have another very special and magical one today. We have Kat DeVos on the show. Welcome, Kat.
Thank you, Jen. Hello.
Hello. So Kat is a fellow therapist as well from California. She's in NorCal, I'm in SoCal. And she's also magical. And I started following you probably when I became a therapist, like a baby therapist. And I remember, first of all, again, I'll say this out loud because I said this to you before we recorded, that you're just so beautiful. You're like an anthro model, okay? All your clothing, everything about you. And then also there was something that I picked up from your Instagram that you were kind of pushing the boundaries around therapy. And that also felt like, holy shit, she's doing something different. I just looked at you of that's who I want to be.
That's such a compliment. Thank you for saying that. And thank you for, I think you're naming a couple layers that feel really important to me and that I resonate with too. Aesthetic is important to me, the look and feel of things. I think that there's something very instinctual and intuitive about aesthetic that we're drawn to or repelled from that has a lot of information in it, like how we curate our spaces, whether it's a virtual space or a physical space or a therapy space, I think plays into the felt sense of something, right? And contacts some higher sense of ourselves. And like we were saying before, there is this kind of rebellious part of me that wants to, I want to say, I rebel with integrity, right?
Yes. Yeah.
Where I do think that there are limits or there are ways that we can kind of stretch the therapeutic boundaries or limits to modernize them, to bring in these additional layers of knowing, right? We were talking about tarot and astrology earlier that really can serve us, right? But that maybe are a little bit edgy. And when I first came to Instagram as a therapist, I think in 2017, not too long after I launched my practice, there weren't a lot of very sound clinical voices in that space. It was a lot of just kind of general health information, but not necessarily from
a therapist.
From a background that felt credible, not always, I should say. And so I saw an opportunity to maybe be feeding some of that information and starting some dialogue in that way. And it's been interesting to see just how, not that I was a, influencer in that space, but it's just been interesting to see how that's grown in the years since. And I think it really speaks to that need for information and access, right? Access to that information versus some of the gatekeeping where it's just information that we're getting in graduate school or in therapy.
Yeah, exactly. And I think there's a little bit of the, everything is on a scale in some way. I think there's a little bit of pop culture can kind of hold on to narcissism was the big thing. Everyone's a narcissist.
Yes.
And it is hard to kind of educate in these 5-second clips, and here's some factual information. But again, it's still coming from therapists, which is very valuable. But it is, how do we kind of use this social media platform as this invitation in to something and not this end all be all.
Right. right? Or where it's like we've done the work because we're saving the posts, right? Like an invitation into, like, at the end of the day, I really believe it's the relationship that heals, right? And that can also be our relationship with self if we're finding ways through any kind of self practice, journaling and whatnot to connect to self. But so much wounding, we'll talk more about that today, happens in the context of relationships. And so as a result, the healing happens in relationship. So, I work with these like brilliant, insightful, aware women. And a lot of that awareness is just, I call it the insight defense, because they can tell you everything about, and they have the language, right?
Yes.
And they can tell you like, this is the history, and this is the defense mechanism, and this is the pattern and the story, but it's not translating into how they move through the world and how they choose relationships and how they show up in relationships and their self-worth and their belief in self, because it's just intellectualized, which is another defense, right? If we're thinking about like parts work, that's another part of us that's like, keep it up here, don't drop into the body. The body isn't a safe place to be. Or the emotional realm is an unknown, scary place. I didn't have holding for that. I didn't have mirroring for that. Don't go there. Don't trust your intuition, right? So a lot of the work I do is how to like take that intellectual information and translate it into the body, translate it into reconnecting and like rehabbing our connection with intuition so that we are noticing a difference in the world. And so, stemming from what you were saying about, the information in reels on TikTok being, I'm not on TikTok. I talk about it like I am an elder millennial, like that. I'm like the crone millennial.
The crone. We need the crone. Wait, how old are you? Am I
millennial? My sister who's how old? She's mid-30s now. She sends me TikToks like via browser, and so I'm like going like my browser. But also say, right, it's like that's great information, and we can start to like unspool from there with the language and with some of these like they're like curiosity hooks. It's like, like is that language that I relate to? And then what do we do with that? How do we kind of bring that down from the cloud, from the brain, right? From the like linguistic center of the brain into the emotional center of the brain, integrate those two so that we can integrate experience.
Right. Well, I will be 40 this year. So I'm just a millennial.
Well,
yeah. I can't wait. I cannot wait.
It's anticlimactic in like a really beautiful way.
Okay, like, it's just like,
we're like,
there it is.
We are. Like, what next? Just getting like old, like witchier.
Yes.
And like wiser. I have visions of myself as like a 80-year-old therapist, like surrounded by my like herbs, drawing.
Trees.
Just
yes.
Like, come into my, it's not even going to be an office. It'll be like, come into my yurt.
Yes. Yeah.
I mean, I'm not too far away from this now.
Right. Exactly. You are on the path. So I will gladly support that. But I am on TikTok a lot. And I think, in anything in social media, but like spirituality is like huge. I think a lot because people are waking up. So am I. I'm like, oh my gosh, tell me all the things. But, and this podcast has kind of turned into therapy and integrating like mental health and integrating spirituality. And one of the things that I see on TikTok a lot are father wounds and mother wounds in relationship to spirituality, mental health, but then also relationships. And I wonder if you can just kind of maybe talk about like the difference between a mother wound and father wound. And then maybe we can dive into the father.
Yeah.
My daddy issues. Yeah.
Ooh, it's such a big one. Yeah, I think from me personally, working with the father wound has been a form of spiritual practice, right? It's like spiritual practice can be defined any way that we want to define it, right? It's like we can define it through our card pulling and our tarot. And it's just another lens to look at the self, right? So spiritual practice to me involves sort of this like excavation process and insight, self-witnessing, inquiry, right? And kind of showing up to, like I said earlier, like bear witness to the self and integrate some of the parts of us that are lost, right? The shadow, like the parts of us that have been kind of cast off, like calling those home, like reclaiming the parts, right? Back to the parts work, and kind of unburdening those parts so that they can serve us better in life. Just that process of, like I said earlier, like healing relationship to self. So working with the father wound, working with a parent wound can be a form of spiritual practice. In general, a parent wound, the mother wound, father wound is like, from a clinical perspective, it's trauma, childhood wounding that resulted from caregivers who were physically or emotionally absent or neglectful or abusive. From more of a spiritual perspective, I think of it as the kind of disintegration or disconnection from the masculine energy, the feminine energy, these parts of us that we have, that we all have, that are not non-gendered and more about these like impulses that we see in the world, or our kind of inner landscape and our inner world. And when a disruption or like a disharmony in that balance happens during childhood, in what we experienced through caretaking, it could be the relationship with our caretaker, it could be what we witnessed, what was modeled for us, that disharmony can show up as different different kind of edgy places for us in the world. And I'll get more specific about that in a second. But the mother wound versus the father wound, the mother wound, the mother we can think of as like our internal landscape, our internal emotional self. It's how we attach to ourselves, how we attach to other people. If we think of it from kind of an astrological perspective, it's like our moon sign, right? Like what's on the inside. It's like our internal, like felt sense of self. Archetypally, the mother is the nurturer. So if our experience was that our emotional needs weren't met in that like nurturing, nutritious way, wounding can occur. And kind of the fundamental question of the mother wound is, am I lovable, right? Kind of going back to that like internal attachment to self. The question is, am I lovable? And this can show up in the world, show up in our lives as trouble self-soothing, self-regulating, highly critical self, right? If we have a parent who withheld or wasn't able to show up in that emotional tending way because they were very critical or depressed or withholding, kind of conditional with their love, right? We might internalize that and be highly critical with ourselves as well. And it shows up in our relationships, codependence, and kind of this part of us that like over tends to the needs of others can be a result of the mother wound.
Are you talking about my life, or did you just name all my things?
Oh, so then the other side, right?
I mean, I got them both, but
well, a lot of people do, right? Because it doesn't have to be as like on the nose and specific as like, this is the mother wound from the mother, this is the father wound from the father. It can be non-blood relatives. It can be from our ancestry and our epigenetics, like what's passed down from our lineage. It can be non-human entities like patriarchy. Like patriarchy has been like deeply wounding. I would say to everyone, but specifically to women. And non-gender conforming folks.
What's interesting when I look back in my own, like, being in therapy, and this is like talking more about like the 3D world, like in my lifetime now, the father wound felt very clear. The father wound was like, oh, okay, obviously. The mother wound, again, like the moon is like, was very hidden.
Yes.
And
Shadowy.
The mother, yes. And that was the most surprising part. I was like, wait a minute. Like, and the hardest part, I think, to face, because the father one was so obvious. So how can I can't have both. Like, I can't be hurt by both. I can't be detached by both. That's how it felt, like the experience. And then also it was like freeing in some way of like, what am I uncovering in this shadow part with my mother wound?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think your experience is common and makes sense too. It's like those layers of the onion that we peel back, where the father represents, from this archetypal perspective, it represents like the protector and the provider, right? And it's about, rather than the internal landscape, it's our sun sign, right? So it's how we show up in the world, our courage to show up in the world, our connection and trust in self, and in trusting that the world is a safe place.
Yeah.
Right? So if we had a father who was physically or emotionally not present, or was not safe, or was unstable due to something like substance abuse, right? That kind of rocks our sense of the world being a safe place, right? We're kind of attuned outward, and that impacts our relationship to the world. Whereas the mother wound, when we're talking about that kind of more shadowy layer, it's almost like at first it's too close to us to be able to recognize, because sometimes this wounding happens before birth, before we have language, right? In like the earliest attachment. And so it's almost like those layers outward, where it's like the father wound is a little bit easier to identify sometimes, because it's like self and the world, and this person was like physically absent, versus some of these other layers that like we almost can't distinguish from, like, well, isn't that just how I am? Like, for me, I'm like, am I sensitive because I'm a Pisces, or because I was like, and because I'm an Enneagram 2 and I'm just very attuned to people's needs? Or was this like hypervigilance that developed as a result of being very keyed into my attachment figures, right? And like monitoring that safety in my environment. It's like really difficult to distinguish sometimes.
Yeah. Yes, exactly. And so would you think, in part of all this wound healing, like father is the entryway into it? I mean, I don't want to give it like, it's not like a generalization, maybe. Like the father wound feels like the first step because it's so external and because it's so, you can identify it easier.
It could be, right? It could be. I think we're all going to have different entry points, right? I think the wounding, however we want to define it, is something that we get to define on our own, right? And a kind of a tricky aspect of that can be naming and owning, articulating that wounding may have been present, even if we have, for all intents and purposes, very good relationships with our parents, right?
Right.
So based on these younger parts of us that want to protect our parents, or are really like over-identified with our parents, mother or father, right? We might not be ready to look closer at that relationship. Right. Whether it's mother or father, based on our relationships. I think a father wound can be, I wouldn't even say like an easier way in, but like maybe a obvious, more like clear way in. Like for me, there was like very clear like trauma and wounding, where it's like, that's an inroads there, right?
I'm gonna have to unpack that later. That was like let me bookmark that one.
Like a little, what do you call it? Like a Easter egg, right? It's like you start to just like unwind the sweater, and you're like, pulling the thread, and you're like, it keeps unraveling, right? But I think this whole process, when we start to look at, is this work I want to do, right? If we accept the invitation into some of the inquiry into our wounds and what the healing process looks like, it starts with just being like a really compassionate self-witness, and being able to connect to the curious part of us, where we can kind of proceed with ease versus activating like our threat response, right? And so whatever inroads we can find where we have the ability to shift into a more curious versus inflamed part of us, I think is is a place to start, right? So
Yeah.
when we're curious about our experience, there are going to be little Easter eggs that pop up first. Like, I wonder what that was about. Or, maybe it's that there's a boundary that needs to be set, right? It's like we're in our adult lives and we keep kind of running up against the same thing with people that we're dating or colleagues or
Yeah.
our family members. And we're
Yeah.
like, there's a boundary I need to set here. And then as we start looking at what is this boundary? Where does this come from? What do I believe about boundaries? That can open up some clarity on what that wounding is and where it is as well. And if it's, like I said, in our nuclear family or if it's more generational.
Can our kids be mirroring a mother or father wound for us too? Or
oh yeah.
okay, I mean that's my life. Yes.
I mean, they're such little mirrors, such little teachers, right? And for me, like this was a motivating factor in doing some of the work that I've done on the father wound. I have a lot of masculine energy in my house, right? My husband, my son, right? It was like boys all over. And so part of my motivation is like not wanting to kind of pass on wounding in how I parent, right? In how I react to my son, and how I react to my husband, right?
Yes. Yeah.
But yeah, our kids can absolutely, right? I think what they do is hold up the mirror to where we're triggered, right? And, if like their anger triggers us, that's actually not about them at all. They're having like a healthy emotional response, right? It's about what is that button that they're pushing and how do I work to deactivate that button, right? What is that anger? What is my response to their anger? Like the part of me that wants to shut down, the part of me that wants to stop it or manage it, right? The part of me that has a hard time tolerating that. Where does that come from, right?
Yeah.
So, they're just like what a beautiful, we keep using the word invitation, like what a beautiful invitation, right? That serves us, but also serves them. Like our willingness to see their behavior as
separate,
healthy, right?
Of you.
Separate, right? And as a place for us to be curious versus critical of them or critical of ourselves. I mean, that just means like hopefully more fun parenting and more ease for all of us.
Yeah. Did your relationship with your father kind of, I don't want to say inspire, but create this need to be a therapist? Or how do I say this? Was your trauma why?
We're talking about like, TikTok. I saw a reel recently. I'm like, rushing around getting ready for the day. And there was like a reel playing in the background. And it said something like, I'm like putting peanut butter on toast. And it's like something about, when you realize that becoming a therapist was the trauma response. And I'm like, freezing what I'm doing, feeling very called out.
Excuse me? No. Okay. I'm healing other people.
I know. I'm like, that feels tracks. Right. Yeah. That tracks. And some of the tendencies I named earlier, something like the hypervigilance, right? Yeah. Like that's something that I've like worked with and transmuted, where now it means that I'm like really attuned to my clients, right? And I can see those little wispy responses that pass through them that again come from like that hypervigilant attunement to a caregiver, kind of monitoring the safety of attachment, and now gets to be repurposed for this kind of higher usage in the work for my attachment with my clients in a way that I hope is really, healing and hopeful, and serves them, right, in our process of getting deeper. But yeah, I would say I wasn't maybe like connecting those dots at the time. Like, I'm going to go into therapy because I want to help, families and eldest daughters work through their perfectionism and performance issues. Like, that wasn't so on the nose. So, I always say, like, I think I was like never not going to be a therapist. Yeah. Right? It also feels like a spiritual practice to me. It feels like little mini ceremonies that I get to sit in 25 times a week.
Yeah. And there is something, as I remember, I mean, being on the spiritual journey or just doing self-work is a lot. And so this year, there was something I was just like, I can't get out of this feeling. Can't even remember what it was, but I was just feeling so heavy. And I was talking to someone and they're like, you're going through this experience so you can help other people in this. And that's essentially why we do the things we do.
Yeah.
But I love how you put it of like, almost like it's for me, like, oh, kind of being aware of where has that transmuted? Where have I healed that? And then where do I still need healing in some things that, because I think sometimes I heal with my clients in some ways. Like there might be some things that come out of my mouth and I was like, oh shit, that was for me too,
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Or
Yeah.
things that come out of my mouth that like came out of my therapist's mouth.
Yes,
right?
yes. My therapist said something really cool and I think you would enjoy it. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and just like our kids hold up mirrors, our clients hold up mirrors for us too, where it's like, ooh, like what is this part of me that's like feeling nervous around this client, or that's like afraid to go into this difficult conversation, like extend this opportunity for a repair, the part of me that's like afraid to rupture, to bring up something that might like anger a client, or that I'm afraid of for whatever reason. Like these are opportunities, like you're saying, for us to look at, okay, this is about this unique relationship and some kind of enactment that's happening here. That's, it's like, it's my stuff, it's their stuff, it's the soup, right?
Yeah.
There's like a part of that we can take responsibility for.
Right.
To say like, this isn't just the client. This isn't just
Yeah.
this little microcosm of a world right here. This also has reverberations back into my history and what I learned about tolerating someone's anger or disappointing someone or making amends, whatever it might be.
Yeah. Did you what was your home like growing up?
It's so interesting. Like, had you asked me 25 years ago, had you asked me 10 years ago, the way that our story kind of evolves over time too. But I'm the oldest of three, so I very much identify with like, the eldest daughter stereotypes of like the perfectionist and some of that, perfectionism, procrastination. My family was also an alcoholic family system. And so some of the roles that are implicit in that, I identify with as well. Like one of the roles is like the hero, right? And that's the good student and the one that sort of like presents to the world. And I don't even know that consciously at the time I was like, I'm going to, do all the activities and be in the plays and play the instruments so that my family looks good. That wasn't conscious, but I wonder in hindsight, like how much of that was just like unconscious role fulfilling. It's interesting. We were talking about aesthetic earlier, and even that's been an interesting piece for me to pull apart, where a lot of like many alcoholic family systems experience this piece around like performance and like how they show up in the world, where it's like they look one way on the outside and then there's messy something else on the inside that's occurring. And so I'm like, is this that I'm just like really into aesthetic and love beautiful things, or is this a trauma response, right? Like everything is not a trauma response. Like, is this the part of me that wanted to like present really well, right, to make up for places that felt murkier? But actually, it wasn't until I went back to graduate school 15 years ago that I even used the word, that anyone in my family used the word alcoholic. That just wasn't language that was a part of our experience. It wasn't how we identified. And so here I am in like family systems class, right? And I'm like, oh, shit. Oh, right?
Yeah.
Identifying that like, oh, like my parent like is an alcoholic. It wasn't just that there was a lot of drinking, but he wasn't angry and, there was no abuse. Like I would always caveat it, like, drinks, but he just, and then really being able to identify like, oh no, there's like a larger system at play. And it was kind of an interesting unraveling from there, where in me naming that and starting to do some of the work, it's like, you know, I sometimes I say like therapy is almost like a family system is like a spider web, right? And if one person goes to therapy, it's like they're the little spider on the web and the whole system shakes.
Yeah.
So starting to do that unpacking and that naming was the beginning of a lot of different like structure shifting that happened in my family.
And part of that narrative of your father, was that from your mom as well? Like, he doesn't drink a lot, or he's not like, do you think that was also kind of picked up from other adults around you, or was mom drinking as well, or kind of denying?
No, it was just him, right? And now that I have more of the language, like I recognize that there was, you know, a lot of enabling going on in the home, but not explicitly. You know, it's not like anything was being like covered up or played down. It was just not talked about. Like my nervous system is so familiar with the experience of like an elephant in the room. Like I can tolerate an elephant in the room like all day, every day. Like it's and that's not a good thing, right? But like that was how I grew up, was just like the elephant in the like no conflict, right? Like everything just being like under the surface. And so it was almost just like there wasn't even the language there. It wasn't that there were concessions made or excuses made. It was like the language
invisible,
wasn't even there. Invisible. Yeah. Then part of that is like, had I been on TikTok as a 16-year-old, I would have been, you know, using all of this language so much. It's almost like it wasn't even in the cultural zeitgeist or in my cultural zeitgeist to be naming these things. And so I think we just didn't have the language. And sometimes, you know, the language can be problematic because it can be really pathologizing. And we see that, I think, on social media now, where like everything has a label. I think it would have been helpful to have that language earlier versus when I was, 26, recognizing like, oh, like this is actually a larger, deeper pattern of dysfunction, and kind of identifying myself as an adult child of an alcoholic, right? And seeing how that shows up in my life, and starting to center some of my work around that boundary setting, right? And the way that then played out in our family system and in the big changes that took place in our family system. It was like cat's out of the bag. We're like naming this elephant. Like,
so you named it after school?
I think ultimately, yes. I also give a lot of credit to my sister, who's 8.5 years younger. She was in our home after my brother and I had left, so I think she was kind of the one, like the canary in the coal mine, like sounding the alarm bells that like this actually is a problem. But I think the domino effect was me going back to graduate school, being in therapy, doing this work, my mom starting to do this work, my sister starting to do this work, and that progressed for me to estrangement. I'm not in contact with my dad anymore, and neither is my sister.
Are they still married?
They are still married.
Oh, damn.
Yeah.
So, is that complicated?
It's really complicated.
Yeah.
So it's interesting because like we shifted from one dysfunctional pattern to a pattern where more is out in the open. Yeah. But it's like that's maybe as far as our family can go in this lifetime or at this point, right? And I do think it's like a healthier version of everything being on the rug, under the rug. It's like, well, this is where we are now. This is what we're able to tolerate as a system. And this also incorporates kind of a different journey that we all have with our boundaries and with this work, right? The kind of the healing the wound work. It's actually interesting because the pattern that's playing out in my family, where I don't have a relationship with my dad due to alcoholism, is the same one that my mom experienced in her family system. So when we talk about like generational, these things being passed through the lineage, they do show up, and it's not always such a direct replica, but it's like these things get passed down until someone says like, okay, I'm going to excavate whatever is happening here under the surface and name it and do the work to repair and recover from it.
Yeah. And so your brother still has a relationship with him?
Yeah, he does.
Okay.
He does.
Hmm.
Yeah. And I think that works for him, right?
Yeah.
A big part of this work is, what do we want and need our boundaries to be?
Yeah. And can we respect everyone else's in a system that chooses different things?
Exactly.
Yeah. So feeling comfortable with the elephant in the room, how did that impact you? Did you act out and be like, this is the emotion, or did you find yourself sweeping your own emotions under the rug?
Mm-hmm.
How did this kind of become your father wound? Like, what did it look like for you in different stages? But
yeah, I think about when you bring that up, it makes me think of like conflict styles and people who have more of like a high conflict or direct conflict management approach, and then people who are conflict avoidant. And you would think, like, logic would lead that people who have a higher conflict style or more comfortable with conflict or go in for conflict have a higher stress tolerance. And I think it's actually the other way around, where someone who's avoidant of conflict has a higher stress tolerance, because it is enormously stressful on the nervous system, on the psyche, to be avoiding conflict in a long-term, ongoing way. So I think that was kind of my experience of just always having just stress that my system was holding in order to manage the kind of the stress and the avoidance of conflict in my family. So I think my emotional world was a lot of like internal processing. I have like boxes of journals at my mom's house, and some here too, of just like my inner world. Like, being with my feelings was a safe place for me, which, we talk about like, why did you become a therapist? It's like, well, I think maybe we have some
let's pull that thread. Yeah.
We have some signs that maybe that was going to be the path. But I think kind of coping with that stress was for me a path into like self-curiosity and inquiry, and looking and just being present to the emotional realm and trying to make sense of it in that way.
Yeah. How did you, because did like this idea of father wounds, does this feel like a more recent kind of discovery, and did that shift or change anything in your healing with your dad, or your not relationship but relationship to him in the disconnection?
Recent for myself, or do you mean like recent culturally?
For yourself. Or was it always like, oh, this is a father wound, and like can a wound kind of like have different stages around it? Like, can it be this like constant unfolding in some way? Or does it feel like this is a father wound and I'm going to heal it, and then
such a good question. It's like the complexity of wounds, right?
Yeah.
Like, how do we, because we're always changing and evolving, right? And so it makes sense that like our wounding is going to evolve. It's like this multifaceted thing, right? Where we can like hold it up to the light and look at it from different angles. It makes me think of grief, actually. I think about the ways that, with grief, we kind of grow around our grief. It doesn't go anywhere. We don't get through it. We don't get over it. It becomes just this like part of us and informs the way we see our world. And grief is very much a part of working with a parent wound, right? Grieving it's like two kinds of grief, right? Our inner child grieving and doing that inner child work, our adult self grieving what we didn't have, right? What we wished we'd had, and also what we don't have now in our lives, right? And, with grief, with any kind of grief, I think at each kind of pivotal developmental stage we hit, we kind of grieve anew, right? Like if we've lost a parent, we might grieve them during, big rites of passage, like a marriage or a divorce or a child being born, right? We're going to grieve their presence and And I think that happens with this kind of wounding as well, where as we grow and mature and are relating to our lives from a different place, new angles, new inroads into that wound are going to present themselves. I think I've been working a lot with like this theme of like midlife and what it means to arrive in midlife and take stock and tap into gratitude and tap into our disappointment, or just kind of finding our footing in this like, okay, here I am, hopefully at my midpoint
Yeah.
place, right?
Mhm.
If not, maybe a little before, if I'm going to be like a 90-year-old crone, like I hope
Yes.
it's not my midpoint.
Yeah. You got a long life, girl.
Right.
So,
But even being in midlife, it kind of is offering like a different reflection on what my wound is, what my relationship to my dad is. And like I said, I don't have a relationship with him anymore. And at this point, at this stage of the work that I'm doing, I am not necessarily expecting that I will. And that I will again, right? That there will be a reunification at some point, which can feel like kind of an edgy thing to name, especially in our culture, which is very like nuclear family
yeah.
focused and really privileges the nuclear family. And there's I think culturally we really grow up with these, tropes around like blood is thicker than water, right?
Yeah.
Or just this general sentiment of like, but they're family, right?
Yeah.
And that implies that we have to tolerate behaviors or treatment that's not okay with us, right? Or that's been hurtful in the past, or that is hurtful now, and that we just need to like stick it out and get over it because that person is family. And this may be an unpopular opinion, but like I don't actually believe that. And I think that can be really harmful, right? For ourselves. And if we're talking about like not passing on this generational wounding, I think about the model that sets for our children too, to
Yeah.
tolerate relationships that are harmful to us because someone is family.
Yeah.
So a lot of my work with the father wound, specifically in the last, 10 years, has been a grieving process, right? And grieving, like I said earlier, like what wasn't present when I was growing up, and what's not present for me now
Yeah.
as an adult, right? He hasn't met my son. He hasn't acknowledged that I have a son, right? And there's grieving in that too.
I think there's something really hard for women to also cut off family or choose to not have family in their lives, because I think even like historically, men can leave, men can go, women stay, right? Women keep the family together. Women, they don't have that choice, and I think about that more of like a father leaving a child and his wife or whoever it is, partner.
Yeah.
So I think there's something really brave about being a woman and saying, I'm still not going to tolerate this in my life because I nurture myself, because I nurture my family, because I nurture these other relationships in my family. That feels taboo in itself. That feels risque. That feels, and I'm like celebrating that because it's beautiful. It's powerful.
And it goes back to that archetype we were talking about earlier, right? The archetype of the women, or more generally of the kind of feminine energy, being the nurturer, being the caretaker, right?
Yeah.
And when that becomes imbalanced, it's like that nurturing and caretaking is self-sacrificing, right? And actually gets out of balance in kind of self-abandoning in order to care for someone else. So I think what you're naming is kind of choosing the self over a relationship that's harmful, right? Choosing not to abandon the self. And yeah, that's powerful.
Yeah. And I think a lot of women, including myself, still don't do that, in motherhood, in what it means to be a mother, in what it means to be in your feminine energy, right? Like, so again, I think it can look however it needs to look, but this is also a reminder of like, are you sacrificing pieces of yourself for someone else? And what is the cost of that for you?
Yeah. And that, I think, speaks to why we would even want to do this work in the first place, right? Where I think that a big part of being an adult is not just the age we reach, right?
Yeah.
It's our willingness to kind of examine our histories and the stories, the narratives that we've been telling ourselves about ourselves, or that someone else has been telling us about us for as long as we've been alive, and really being willing to engage in this process of inquiry of what our histories say and what we want them to say. It's about reclaiming our narratives and maybe transforming them to beliefs that better serve us, right?
Yeah.
It's about shifting away from what has happened to us to how we're relating to what's happened, right? From this place of agency and choice and taking responsibility for what we have control over, and like surrendering, letting go of what we don't have control over, right?
Yeah.
Versus feeling bound by a story that we've outgrown, or a pattern that keeps us stuck in a victim narrative.
Right. Yeah, exactly. Can you kind of name some aspects, like if people are listening, like, I don't know if I have a father wound, like how does this show up in relationships, or what would be the most prominent way of,
like, how would we identify, like, maybe that's...
Yeah.
Well, like we were saying, it kind of represents the sun sign. So like how we show up in the world, the courage to show up in the world, self-trust, self-esteem. It looks like, I think, or can look like an over-identification with success, productivity, career, right? If we think about that archetype of the provider and the protector, it's kind of over-identification with the masculine in that way, which can feel a little bit ironic, right? If we have a father wound, we're over-identifying with the masculine energy. But the central question, we were saying with the mother, it's, am I lovable? With the father wound, it's, am I worthy, right? So there can be this over-identification with these things that we deem as kind of confirming our worthiness in the world, how much money we make, our status, like how we're seen. Also looking for and relying on external sources of validation, right, to confirm our worthiness back to us, versus that being more innate. Like, I know I'm worthy, and it's not tied to the promotion I get, right, or how much money I make, but, relying on other people for that, that feedback. And so that kind of keeps us stuck in that cycle of having to perform and excel and get the accolades to keep keep gas in the tank, in the worthy tank. And that can also just show up as, places where we're struggling with our self-esteem, self-confidence, our self-trust too. These things we need to navigate the world.
Yeah. I don't know, like the ages of your clientele, and this is again from TikTok, but it seems there for the younger women that haven't found a partner, but there's this question of like, did I girl boss too hard? Like, did I overdo this masculine energy, and where am I able to find love? And so when you frame it in this like worthy perspective, not all the women are doing that, but it's just interesting the things that we pick up as a generation, like I feel like ours was like, you can be anything you want to be, but you got to go to college. But you can be anything you want to be, and then you're like, well, I don't know what I'm going to do. And then we also, I think millennials are like transmuting a lot of pain to reparent differently. But yeah, I don't know if, I guess I'm just like asking, are you seeing a trend of women that maybe haven't found love, that are kind of stuck in this father wound, in this perfectionism, in this overdrive? And or does it relate to being in a relationship or not?
Yeah. Oh, that's such a good path to go down. So interesting. My clients have really grown up with me, right? So at this point, a lot of my practice, like we're all kind of in this like late 30s to I would say like early 50s place versus 10 years ago when we were like kind of wrestling with like the Saturn returns content, right?
Yeah.
But what I hear in that question is kind of another place where maybe we can be motivated to do this wound work, whether it's a mother wound or a father wound, right? Because that question of like, did I girl boss too hard, right? Is that why I'm not connecting with someone? It makes me think about the imbalance of the masculine and feminine energy, right? If masculine is more of this like external, like our work in the world, like kind of being out there, where the feminine is more about the receptivity. We need to have that balance for intimate relationships and relationships in general, right? It's like people need to see where they can connect with us, right?
Yeah.
You know, we might have it all in that kind of performative way, but like, what's the inroads to, you know, vulnerability? What's the inroads to making a connection with this person? It's a little more evolved than like, what do they need, right? Maybe it's less about needs and like needing partnership or like needing another person, but we need to kind of show people where we're available to connect and how we're available to connect. And if we're out of balance, right, because we're overcompensating or undercompensating for the ways that our emotional needs were not met, right? Or we're overcompensating because we have this question of like, am I worthy? And we're trying to like continually prove to the world, like, yes, I am. Yes, I am.
Yeah.
That kind of creates almost like a whirlpool. Like where does someone like step in to connect with us in that, right?
Because we aren't connecting with ourselves. So we're constantly searching, am I worthy? Am I worthy?
Yeah. Or we're stuck in like the repetition compulsion, right? Like the repetition compulsion being this unconscious drive that we have to recreate situations in which we were hurt, to try to like create mastery. Like this time I'm going to get it right. I'm going to recreate this situation.
Yeah.
And this time I'm going to get it right. This time it's not going to hurt. I'm going to heal it.
Yeah.
But the kicker is that we can't repair that situation until we have the insight into how to do it differently, right? So this is a common thing we see in therapy, right? It's like clients coming in, they're like, what is this pattern that keeps playing out in my dating life? Why do I choose unavailable men? Right?
Yes.
Why am I always ending up in situations where my, you know, boss treats me in this really demeaning, belittling way? Why am I always so afraid of people in positions of authority? Or why do I, you know, find myself again and again in codependent relationships, right? So that could be a part of it too. It's like, what is the repetition? What is I actually, you know, think it's a really healthy impulse, right? It's the part of us that's like, let's figure this out. Like, let's move through this, right? Let's evolve this into something that serves us more. But when we kind of notice those patterns repeating, I think that can be kind of like a neon arrow to like, there's something
right here.
Yeah. Like eat at Mel's. Like, it's like, this is the place. This is the bruise, right?
Yeah. What would be the first step in addressing a father wound?
I think it's that curiosity, right? It's like, what is the story I've been telling myself? So it's like the curiosity of like, where are those neon arrows? What am I being directed to that like maybe I don't even want to look at, right? I think about our conversation with like, what are we going to talk about today? And I'm like, let's talk about intuition and the overlap of intuition and anxiety. And you're like, great. And so let's make that personal. And then as I'm thinking like, well, how do I want to personalize the conversation of intuition? And my intuition was like, well, you should talk about the thing you don't want to talk about. Like, this is the thing, right? This is where like the work is. This is where my work is. And then hopefully that's work that serves others as well. But I think it starts with like curiosity and courage to maybe like turn over the rocks that we don't want to know what's scampering around underneath, or to like invite the elephants in the room to come sit at the table, and our triggers, right? Whether it's triggers with friends, triggers with colleagues, triggers with our kids. Like those we keep saying that it's an invitation, right? Those are opportunities to look closer to and take responsibility. Like that's, like we said earlier, a big part of, I think, being an adult and being in our power, right? And really being able to kind of walk the path of our like highest, healthiest, most healed, wise selves, right? So curiosity, willingness to just kind of sit with what hurts, to get information about what might be offered there. And a lot of that work might be internal, right? It doesn't always mean that we're setting these really explicit boundaries or walking the path of estrangement, right? That I think often comes as like a last resort, where it's like the acknowledgement of like, oh, there actually isn't the capacity in this relationship for us to work towards communication and healing where repair is possible, right? I think of that as a last resort. And so a lot of the work might be internal, where it's about accepting, what's happened to us. And accepting is not condoning what's happened, right? Accepting means that we're just like willing to be in relationship with reality, right? And when we're in acceptance, that means that we can begin the healing, because we're saying, yes, this is what happened.
Yeah.
And it doesn't define me. And I get to tell a new story now. And forgiveness might be part of that story, but forgiveness is for us, right? Forgiveness is something that we come to on our own, and it's to free up parts of ourself if we want to get there, right? But I think it starts with acceptance, which might lead into a grieving process, an active, kind of ongoing grieving process. And from there, I think there's this interesting opportunity to start to create new frameworks for what we would like our relationship with the masculine, with the feminine, either literal people in our lives or just those energies, those entities in the world, in us. We get to create new frameworks for what we want that to look like, what that represents to us, what that means, who represents that, how we connect with that energy, right? Who are our supports and our allies in this work, and who can we have healing relationships with? The work I've done with my husband over the last 15 years, I think has been like the most healing, reparative work of my life, right? And then watching him parent in this like really like attentive, like vulnerable way has actually been healing for like my little self, right?
Yeah.
Like kind of both feeling so much appreciation for the way he parents, and also that sort of unearthing another layer of grief around like, man, like what would have been different if I had experienced that? Like a dad that's like getting teary because he's, just so in love with our kid. It's so sweet to see, to like be a part of.
Can I ask, what in your life now, like what does, I'm gonna use the word healthy, but I don't know if that's right, but what is your, like being in a healthy masculine energy look like for you? And what does like being in your healthy feminine energy look like for you? Sometimes it just feels like it's different for everybody.
Yeah.
But sometimes I think it's helpful to like name that and what that actually can look like.
Mm-hmm. Oh, that's a really good question. Yeah. Well, I think about like, if masculine energy kind of represents like our work in the world, I think this is an example actually of being in healthy masculine balance, where it is like my work in the world. It's something that like makes me nervous, that feels a little bit like a risk, but it's kind of like relying on my self-support, self-confidence, like self-trust to do something that feels edgy, right? That also is like me, like I'm speaking from my professional self. Like this, my professional self, my personal self, there's a lot of blending there. Like this isn't performative. Like this isn't like a role that I step into, but I am speaking from like my capacity as a therapist, as a professional that's also experienced a lot of this stuff on a personal level as well. So I think that actually feels like a healthy blend of masculine, where I'm like really feeling connected to the work that I'm doing in the world, not because it like validates my self-worth, but because it's like really energizing. And I actually think that's a place where it does connect back to intuition, right? When I am intuitively in line with something that feels right, it does feel like this little lightning bolt of energy, right? And I feel that in this conversation, like really, it's like 8:30 in the morning on a Friday, and we're talking about like parent wounds. Like it's not necessarily something that people are
super
gonna like
sexy
leap out of bed to talk about, but it does feel, it feels really powerful to me. And I know that I'll like coast on this energy the rest of the day. So yeah, when I think about the work in the world, it's like, this feels like work that I'm like proud of, that I feel is in service to me and others. And it's also work, you know, it is kind of like my provider self. Like this is part of how I provide for my family and provide for my clients. It has a little bit of that like warrior archetype energy to it, right? Because it's like that powerful, vital life force self, right?
And it's external. Like you are being seen here.
That's very true too. Right? Sun sign, right? It's like what other people see. And I think when that energy is balanced, the moon or the mother, the female archetype energy is I was going to say maybe it's like naturally the counterbalance for that, but I think it's more of what we were talking about when we first hopped on, where I'm like, I got my tarot decks, I've got my like crystals all around, like I have all of these pieces, like these parts that feel more like essence energy versus the vital life force energy. And by essence energy, sometimes I think about that as like, what did you love to do when you were little before you were like told what to do?
Creativity
right?
of it.
And that was like me in the woods making like potions with like cedar, you know, cedar bark and like crushing up nettles and like a little homemade mortar and pestle, like, you know, like herbs and plants have like been a part of my life forever. And so I think feeling like the phrase that comes up to me is like feeling really in love with the other things I'm doing in my life that are not necessarily tied to professional output or professional endeavors is a sign for me that the feminine is being tended to. It's also play and rest for me. So like just playing with my family, right? And resting in a way that like is not tied to like anything productive is a big part. Like cooking is a big part of how, and you know, it doesn't always have to be so like stereotypical. Like I'm like cooking and like, you know, decorating my house, but like those things do feel like a balance of the feminine. It's things that connect more to like the inner landscape, right? The things that make me feel most like me. And when I'm not doing things that make me feel like me, because it's been a really busy week, or Mercury's been in retrograde for a month, or what, or I'm like not sleeping well and so I'm tired, that can kind of throw the feminine out of orbit too. I think.
Having to rebalance
I'm like edgier, right? It's like I'm edgier. Like if we think of it as the inner landscape and the attachment to self and other, I feel those attachments start to fray because my emotional needs aren't getting met. And so it's harder for me to attune to and support others in getting their needs met.
Totally. Oh, I love it. Okay, I'm just gonna do a quick fire questions just because I want to know like your experiences in life. They're very easy. Okay, you said you were a Pisces. A Pisces sun sign. What's your rising and moon?
Rising is Capricorn, which I think kind of keeps my Pisces a little bit in check, and my moon is a Libra.
Oh, okay. Do you know your human design type?
I don't. A human design
it's a wild thing.
Like a mystery to me. I would love to know more. And I've been told things that people are like, I think this, but it's almost like it doesn't even stick in my brain. Like it feels like a different language. So,
it is. It's a whole new thing. So like,
Do you know human design? Are you learning it?
I mean, I don't know it, but I know my type. I know a little. I know like a little bit of everything. And then if you ask me any deeper things, I'm like, oh no, guys, let's Google that.
But it changed the subject, right?
Yes. But it's so interesting because I just love all these little pieces.
Yeah.
Because I don't think, again, one thing is the end all be all, you know?
Totally.
It's like
Totally.
how it all kind of plays out.
Yeah.
Have you done a past life regression? Do you believe in past lives? Or you're a witch in past
I
life?
do believe in past lives. I've never done a past life regression. No.
Okay.
Yeah. But I do. I believe in like our soul tribes, right? I believe
Yeah.
that like there are little like posses that travel together.
Yeah.
Right? That familiarity of like connecting with someone or someone in our family or like an animal, like our familiars, right? People that were like, I know you. Like
Yeah.
we've been around.
Yes.
We've been around together
Yes.
before. Yeah.
Do you read fantasy smut?
I don't. I'm so bored.
I
tried. My sister tried to get me into the
ACOTAR.
what is it?
A Court of Thorns and Roses.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think I read like 1.5 and I was like, I can't do it. I can't do it.
That's okay. That's okay. You know what's interesting, because I'm like deep into it. I cannot read self-help, but there's so much magic in that feels so beautiful for me to like connect to. Like when she was like talking to the animals and I'm like, oh my gosh, I can talk to the animals. Like there's something very magical about that that's just like brings me to life. So you don't have to, because you are making potions on your day-to-day.
I have magic in other ways. I mean, it's so good for our brains, right? Like imagination, like creative play. It's like these are opportunities for our brain to like disengage from the doing and just like wander. I think it's whether it's fantasy smut, whether it's potion making, whether it's like drawing your card, just how are we giving ourselves a little bit of everyday magic?
Yes. You know? Yeah. Which, I mean, we don't need to talk about right now, but there also can be a witch wound.
Yes. I was thinking about this morning when I was like, am I like is this through?
Okay. I will send you a YouTube video. But part of I just briefly mentioned this, like there was like obviously I was like hung as a witch as a past life, whatever. Anyway, but part of my healing in this lifetime and part of what this podcast is I was afraid to use my voice because I would be killed for it or I'd be ridiculed for it. And there's a lot of times, like subconsciously for me, that I'm like, oh, I don't want to say, I'm also a 9 on the Enneagram. So I'm like, I don't want to say anything bad. I don't want to say, like, can I say that? Can I do this? And so this podcast has been such a beautiful healing process of, you know, some people in my family might not like what I'm saying here or whatever, but I have to stay true to me. And it's been like this unveiling of so many things. And so it's been really healing for that wound. So
2 things I will say about that.
Yeah.
One, like the witch wound. One is I have a lot of like Nordic ancestry. And when I was doing my herbalism training, part of our like final culminating project was to dive into our respective ancestries and learn about the plants that our ancestors used. And so when I was studying, I mean, Nordic folklore, Nordic tradition is like so rich. Like talk about magic. Like they believed in like elves and you know, all sorts of spirits. And fairies. You know, more of a like violent side of Nordic history, but like the Viking culture. And I learned about the Nordic velour, and velour means seer. So like seer. And so the Nordic velours were like the Nordic witches. Like they were like the green witches. And as I'm learning about them, I'm like, oh, like this makes so much sense. This is part of me that's like coming back to the plants. And so yeah, I love that quote. It's like, we are the daughters of the witches you couldn't burn, right?
Oh my God.
Have you heard that, right?
No.
I get chills when I think
Can we
about
get t-shirts
that.
with that?
Yeah, it's like our bumper sticker logo. Yeah. And I really feel that, like the magic that gets passed down generationally, and like were there Nordic velour in my lineage, like these plant medicine women, right? What is a witch? It's a woman who's connected to the earth, right? And that gives me chills too. It's like that there's lineage there. And so they're like you're saying, like power and like ruffling feathers, or maybe, you know, speaking things and inviting guests on to say things that are a little against the grain, or that are a little countercultural, but that invite us into connecting to these parts of ourselves or these parts of our lineage.
Oh, okay. So do you make potions? Do you do herbal?
I do.
Like,
I do.
okay,
Yeah.
tell us where to find you. Plug all the things, girl. Like, if somebody wants to do therapy with you, how can they find you? And then your retreat, and then I wanted to hear about herbalism.
That sounds great. Let's see. You can find me on Instagram, cat.devos, and I'm sort of like waking that tiger back up, starting to like
take your time,
re-engage in ways that feel organic, right? When I have something that feels exciting to share, I'm there. They can connect with me on my website, which is kdollentherapy.com, my former last name. And also, I think you have all these links too. That's what my therapy practices. I'm doing something that's been like a big life goal for a while that I'm so excited about. Talk about alignment with intuition. I'm leading a retreat to Greece in October.
My God.
With these two women that I connected with earlier in the year that have been, they're Greece-based, they're Greek. They've been hosting yoga retreats for years, and they wanted to start incorporating more self-development work. And so found me somehow and invited me in to lead their first ever self-development retreat. And so I'm calling it Ceremony of Self.
I love it.
And it's like in the mountains of Greece, like nestled against this like forest. Like it's an unbelievable, like I can feel the energetic charge like from here. Beautiful location at this wellness spa. And it's 6 days, 5 nights. Each day we're going to have a workshop that's just a little mini ceremony that offers a different lens to look at the self. Values work, Enneagram, parts work, inner landscape, outer ecosystem, just ways to kind of play with these different angles of self, and work to do individually. We'll bring it back together with the option to share. And then one of my dearest friends is coming along as our yoga teacher. And so she's also offering daily yoga to just help our nervous systems recalibrate and settle. And also we have, lots of time for rest. Each evening I've planned a sunset social as a way to just like also bring in like levity. So these will be like, it'll be card drawing, it'll be herbal education, it's going to be forest walks, it's going to be Byzantine, bath ritual, like it's all the things. So that's in October, and I'll send you that link as well. And have a few more spots. So the constellation that's forming is like it's a beautiful group of people. And I just really trust that the people that are meant to land will land with you there.
Oh, I love it. Yeah. And we'll put that all in the show notes. Okay. And then are you making tinctures? What's happening? Tell me.
Yeah. I make them a lot for myself, my friends. This is where I get like a little bit like renegade, where, with our licensure, we're like technically not in our scope of practice if we're giving herbal advice. But, I'll like, this deck is like a beautiful deck of like plant allies. So I'll like draw plant cards with my clients, or, there are herbs I think are like really safe and like super effective. So many of our pharmaceuticals are actually derived from plants. Yeah. So let's just like skip the pharmaceutical part with the side effects and like go straight to the plant, right? So I make tinctures. I do a lot of like tea infusion, and we'll make, gifts for friends. I have like a domain that I've purchased for someday
Get
launching
it going.
Blends, like different like customized tincture blends. And that feels like a really like, you talk about like balancing the feminine. That feels like a really sweet place that I want to, that feels also like something that I will have for the rest of my life. So I don't feel like a lot of urgency to like get that in the world now. Like I don't need to like make it a side hustle, but it does feel like a way that I connect to magic in my life. Even when I'm just like making my tea in the morning, it's like my little daily potion.
Yes. I love it. Kat, okay, well, I'm so excited to hang out with you every day from now on.
I know. So we're going to start our Fridays this way. We're going to start with our card draws. We're going to spread out all of our decks. Like I said, we'll like cast the web. We'll like
light our candles.
Yeah.
So good. Thank you so much for coming on. You're the freaking best.
This has been so fun.
Yeah. We'll put all that in the show notes. If Greece is calling you, please go, guys.
Yeah.
Please go. Thank you so much.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Thanks for listening to our show. If you are interested in going to Greece with Kat this October, go ahead and check out our show notes for more information. And again, thanks for being here. We'll see you next time.